In 550 BCE, a strange foreigner appeared in the city of Sardis. He was a famous traveller who had made appearances all over the ancient world, giving advice to kings and commoners. His name was Solon, one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece and the grandfather of democracy. The king of Sardis, Croesus, was enthusiastic to show Solon his prospering city. He gave the sage a thorough tour to show off his immense wealth. And it wasn't for nothing that rich as Croesus was a common saying meaning excessively wealthy. After the tour, King Croesus and Solon sit down for dinner. The king asks his guest who the happiest person he had ever met was. He expected the answer to be himself, as he had just spent the entire day showing off his unrivaled wealth and power. Instead, Solon tells Croesus stories. A story of a man who died in battle after seeing his children grow to adulthood, and the story of 2 brothers who died in their sleep after their mother prayed for their happiness. The king is furious at this, asking Solon why he disdains the kingdom of Lydia and its people so much that he would deny them their unrivaled happiness. Solon explains to him that fortune, not wealth, make a man happy. A person's true fortune can't be measured before the end of their life, and without taking the quality of their death into account. The king finally learns this lesson when he takes in a young exiled noble as an ally, treating him like a member of the royal household, despite the man's history as a brother slayer. One day, whilst hunting a boar, the young noble accidentally kills Croesus' son Atys. Distraught at what he has done, the young noble kills himself by the grave of the prince. And broken by the loss of his son, Croesus learns that no amount of money will ever bring his child back. He probably thought at the time that this was as bad as things would get, but the gods weren't done teaching this greedy and arrogant king humility. As his reign draws on, Croesus becomes more and more obsessed with oracles, a kind of fortune-telling device from the ancient world, and he becomes especially fond of the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, which he showers with famous amounts of gifts in an attempt to win the gods' approval. He asks it all kinds of questions until finally the topic of the Persian Empire comes up. In the east, the Median king, Astyages, Croesus' brother-in-law, had been overthrown by a Persian called Cyrus. Wanting to nip this new threat in the bud, Croesus asks the oracle at Delphi, "If I go to war with Persia, what will happen?" The oracle gave one of its most famous responses. "If you make war on Persia, a great empire will fall." Now this of course means anything. Both Lydia and Persia are great empires. The oracle is essentially saying that if there's a war, someone is going to lose, and it doesn't really take a god to figure that out. But remember that the story of Croesus is a Greek parable for the dangers of hubris, so of course he takes this as the gods telling him that he will defeat Persia. And so in about 547 BCE, Croesus crosses the border of the Hellenes River into Persian territory, and seals his fate. In Iran, Cyrus is busy building palaces in the south, and generally getting used to being king. He has employed Harpagus, the old Mede who defected to him early in his war against Astyages as a general, and when he receives news that the Lydian army is rampaging through his territories in Anatolia, he summons his own army and marches to meet Croesus. He catches Croesus while he's busy sacking the city of Pteria, and in autumn of 547 BCE, the 2 armies clash, but indecisively. Both the Lydians and the Persians suffer massive casualties, but when nightfall ends the battle, neither side is victorious. It looks a lot like this war will be similar to the one fought around 40 years earlier, that the 2 superpowers would be too evenly matched to destroy each other, and they'd eventually settle on a peace. The timing of the battle, late autumn, gave Croesus a great deal of confidence. He sent emissaries to King Nabonidus of Babylon and Pharaoh Amasis of Egypt, and when the war season resumed in summer, he would have not only a larger coalition force than the Persians, but he would also force a second front to open in the south of Cyrus's heartland. This confidence was shattered almost immediately, when Croesus heard word of Cyrus marching on his capital. The Persian king had defied convention by keeping his army in the field even after the campaign season was over. Croesus' army had largely disbanded and gone home, and now the enemy was at his doorstep. Luckily for the Lydian king, a force of Egyptians had arrived to back him up, but seeing little alternative, Croesus marches out of his capital in December to face Cyrus in battle. He still has the famous Lydian Cavalry on his side, so he could still crush the Persians even here in his own country. When Cyrus sees the Lydians line up for battle, he sees that the horsemen will be his greatest challenge. His general Harpagus has a plan, however. He takes the camels that were used to carry supplies and instead puts soldiers on their backs. Being a Mede, a people famous for their knowledge of horses, Harpagus knows that the smell of camels scares the hell out of the animals. When the Persian line advances, they send their camels out in front, and when the Lydian horses get close enough, they panic and bolt all over the field. Croesus isn't ready to give up, however. He orders his men to dismount and advance on foot to meet the Persians. A fierce battle ensues, where the Persians eventually get the upper hand with the help of another big-brain move on behalf of Cyrus. He creates wooden platforms and towers behind his infantry line to allow his men to shoot down on the Lydians from the safety of behind their own line, and the Lydians are eventually pushed back to the walls of the Sardis Acropolis. The Persians settle in to besiege Croesus, who has men constantly patrolling the steep slope up to his position. Croesus considers his position. Although he's clearly in a tight spot, he hasn't lost yet, and if he can hold out until the Egyptians arrive with reinforcements, or the Babylonians attack Cyrus from behind, then the war might still be won. After 14 days of siege, a Persian soldier notices that the steepest face of the Acropolis was also the most lightly guarded, probably because Croesus didn't expect anyone to be mad enough to try and climb it. Sadly for him, though, they do, and before long the city is filled with Persian soldiers, and Sardis falls. Croesus is discovered watching his city fall, utterly dumbfounded. Unable to put up any fight, he's taken alive, and while the battle for the city is wrapping up, Cyrus orders a huge funeral pyre built. When Croesus is delivered to him, he ties the deposed king to the pyre along with 14 male Lydian children, one for each day the siege had lasted, and sets it on fire. Supposedly, while the flames rise around him, Croesus begins screaming the name of that old Athenian man who had chastised him for his arrogance a few years earlier. Cyrus is taken aback by this and asks Croesus who Solon was. Croesus responds by telling him that Solon was a man that every ruler on earth should meet, and when the king had boasted to the sage of his fortune, the old man had dismissed it as pointless. He knew now that his money couldn't buy him good luck. Cyrus considers this and thinks about the similarities between Croesus and himself. He realizes that the only real difference between the two kings is that he had enjoyed enough luck recently to win this war, but one day he might too find himself in Croesus's position, so he orders the fires extinguished. And so this is how Croesus goes from being king of Lydia to advisor to the king of Persia. And yeah, Cyrus just straight up invited Croesus to join his inner circle and asked him for advice on policy and such. The first bit of advice comes instantly. Croesus asks the king why everyone around them is running about so frantically. Cyrus responds semi-sarcastically, well, they're sacking your city and destroying or carrying off all of your possessions. Croesus responds by saying it's not my city, but yours. These are not mine, but your possessions. Cyrus doesn't have a retort to that, and instead orders his men out of the city, and spares what remains of Sardis. And so the kingdom of Lydia falls, and Persia becomes more powerful, and the wealthy King Croesus takes his place as dutiful servant to Cyrus the Great. At least that's the Greek story, and it is very Greek. The first clue is the importance of Solon to the story. To the Greeks, and the Athenians in particular, Solon was a legend. He was like a mix between a founding father and a Gandalf-esque wise old man. But to the rest of the world, however, he really wasn't as important as all that. The message of the story, that fate is inescapable and hubris is the common cause of the ruin, is outstandingly Greek in its nature. Interestingly, the Babylonian sources talk about a war at this time between Cyrus and a rival kingdom. Although we don't know if this refers to Croesus and the Lydians, the Babylonians make a point of saying Cyrus puts him to death, so maybe Croesus does burn on the pyre after all. Then again, Cyrus did famously spare Astyages, the Median king who had tried to kill him. Maybe some kings were spared and some weren't. Either way, what we know for sure is that in 546 BCE, the empire of Lydia is annexed by Persia, and by doing so the Persians are brought into their first contact with the Greeks. The Ionians of Asia Minor were one of the most interesting people that had been previously ruled over by Croesus. Their rebellious nature meant that they had obtained a special status in the Lydian Empire. They were allowed an unprecedented degree of autonomy, provided that they stay loyal. After all, the Greeks and Lydians weren't too different. They shared at least some of the same gods at least, and Herodotus tells us that the only noticeable cultural difference was their age of consent. The Greeks rarely did stay loyal, however, because they had this bizarre belief in a right to self-govern. Regardless, though, they sent a delegation to Cyrus with a request that they be allowed the same deal with the Persians that they had previously signed with Croesus. Cyrus puts them well and truly in their place, as he points out that he had invited them to join his alliance before the war, and they'd refused. He scoffs at the arrogance of the Ionians, who had stayed on the sidelines during the war, waiting to see who won, and now they come to him demanding to be treated like they'd been a full ally the entire time. The Ionians get the message and return home to build fortifications and stockpile food and weapons. They send messages to mainland Greece to ask the most powerful state, Sparta, for help protecting them against the Persians. This is how the king of Persia meets the Spartans for the first time. Strange, long-haired men, all wearing the same clothes and smelling of perfume. They swaggered straight up to Cyrus, failing to prostrate or even bow to him. One of them would address him, failing to ask permission to or use any of Cyrus's royal titles. And the Spartan tells the king that if the Persians should harm any Greeks, the city of Sparta would not tolerate it. He probably expected that the mere mention of Sparta, the most powerful and respected of the Greek cities, would discourage the Persians from causing any trouble. But the Persian king, in one of history's greatest put-downs, responds by asking what the hell a Sparta was. When somebody tells him the truth of the matter, that Sparta was a tiny and inconsequential city-state on some peninsula miles away, Cyrus laughs. He tells the Spartans, "I have never yet found occasion to fear men who dedicate space in their towns to meet and make false promises to each other." This was an umbrella insult towards Greek culture in general. The mercantile Greeks centered their town around a marketplace where people would meet and do business. But to the Persians, merchants, businessmen, and people of similar professions were the lowest and most despised group in society. This disdain that Cyrus shows for Greek culture foreshadows one of his empire's greatest problems. The Persian Empire was now big enough that it was encountering people like the Greeks, with whom it had opposing and incompatible values. The Persians had a number of customs that the Greeks found weird. Luckily, Herodotus went on holiday to Persia at some point in his life and saw firsthand why the Persians could never really absorb Greek peoples into their empire, the same way that it did many other cultures. For the first 5 years of a male Persian's life, he would never meet his father. Instead, he would be raised by his mother and female relatives until he came of age. From the age of 5, he finally meets his dad and begins his education in the 3 things a Persian man must know: archery, horsemanship, and honesty. To the Persians, honesty was a religious duty. To be treated as a liar was accepted to mean execution. The most disgraceful thing to be accused of was a lie. Second was falling into debt, but only because in their view, somebody who owes money is obliged to lie because of it. To the Greeks this was mad. Debt was a part of life for most people, and everybody lied. One of their greatest heroes was famous for using lies, deception, and trickery to get his way. And where a Persian would see Odysseus as an obvious villain, the Greeks cheered when he deceived his way out of sticky situations. The Greeks also looked with disgust at the Persian kingship. Very few Greek cities had kings, and those that did often saw them as more like leading citizens than total autocrats. The Greeks didn't refer to their kings by title, but by their first name. To the Spartans, the king's subservience to the law was so important that they elected officials called ephors to watch over him, ready to prosecute and even execute kings who overstepped their authority. Most Greek cities considered monarchy to be too despotic in principle, removing any individual or family who gained too much power after a generation or two. To the Persians, however, the absolute power of the king was the natural order of things. Although the Persians themselves weren't into this, the Near East had a long history of worshipping their leaders as divine, or at least linked with the divine. They would have looked at the Greek cities and wondered why they were constantly cutting down their clearly most able men. To the xenophobic Greeks, there could be no greater shame than being ruled by an autocratic foreigner. Deeply protective of their culture and political autonomy, the Spartans would one day go so far as to execute one of their kings for adopting foreign customs. To the Persians, absorbing the best elements of the people they encountered wasn't even flinched at. In fact, like most nomadic peoples, they were happy to take customs from the people they encountered. Their clothing style they took from the Medes, their battle armor from the Egyptian designs, and despite their disdain for them, according to Herodotus, they adopted the Greek habit of homosexual pederasty. Lastly, there was the matter of empire. To the Persians, large, centralized empires had been the norm for centuries. Despite the fact that the Persians themselves were made up of many different tribes, who made only a small part of the greater Aryan people, who were surrounded on all sides by different cultures that they had constant contact with, the fact that the king of only one of these tribes ruled over all the others was never really questioned. But the Greeks, on the other hand, valued local autonomy over all else. To them it didn't matter if the king of Persia was a tyrant or a magnanimous and good king. He was foreign, and so to be ruled by him was tantamount to shameful slavery. The Persians couldn't understand this. To them the practice of serving the king was duty. What the Greeks did, the practice of buying and selling each other, like cattle, that was slavery. To the Persian, who was unfamiliar with the institution of slavery as the Greeks knew it, the logic of someone from Sparta, a state where over half the population was part of a deeply mistreated helot class, calling him a slave for having a king, was crazy. But the nuances of why this relationship might not work was probably lost on Cyrus. He just conquered the Ionians. Easily, actually. All except for Miletus, ever the exception amongst the Ionian cities, which was given its special privileges back, probably for selling out its fellow cities. Typical of Cyrus's rule, he rewarded those that stayed loyal, as well as punishing those that didn't. Actually, scratch that, it wasn't Cyrus who did this conquering after all. He left it to Harpagus. Cyrus himself had to leave Sardis quickly. The letters that Croesus had sent before he had surrendered had reached the Babylonians, and war was brewing on his southern border. But the conquest of Babylon and the rest of Cyrus's rule is a long story, best left for next time.